Around 3 o'clock in the morning on a freezing January night in Denver, a man burst through the building manager's office door, screaming. Within minutes, 30-year-old Claire Wilkins was pronounced dead on her bedroom floor. The gun that killed her was inside a closed safe. Her hands had no gunshot residue. And the man who found her, her husband Cain, would soon tell two very different stories about what happened in that room. A jury convicted him of murder and gave him 48 years in prison. Then, 4 years later, an appeals court set him free. They said the case was too close to call. Too many questions. Too much reasonable doubt. This is the story of a birthday party that ended in death, a marriage that unraveled behind closed doors, and a legal battle that's still not over. Clarissa Wilkins, everyone called her Claire, grew up in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb just east of Denver. She was creative, the kind of person who found beauty in small things. She loved to paint. She loved her children more than anything else in the world. Friends described her as warm, the type of person who'd drop everything to help someone in need. By her mid-20s, she was working full-time as a store manager. The job was demanding, but she handled it. Then she met Cain Wilkins. Cain was older, about 15 years older than Claire. He'd been married before. He had children from previous relationships. By the time he met Claire, he was working in construction, living a quiet life, trying to move forward from his past. Their connection seemed natural at first. Claire embraced her role as a stepmother. Social media posts from those early years showed smiles, celebrations, family dinners. Cain posted publicly about how grateful he was for his family. To the outside world, they looked happy. But behind closed doors, things were different. According to Claire's closest friends, there were warning signs early on. They said Claire confided in them about Cain's temper. They said she described moments when his anger would flare up over small things. One friend claimed Claire once told her that Cain had chased her with a gun before they got married. Another said Claire had called the police during an argument because she was afraid. These are allegations, claims made by people who loved Claire and wanted to protect her. Cain has denied them. But they paint a picture of a relationship that was far more complicated than those smiling photos suggested. By 2018, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Claire was still working full-time. Cain had lost his job. Money was tight. The stress of being the sole breadwinner weighed on Claire. Friends said she seemed exhausted, overwhelmed. She told them she felt pressure from every direction: work, home, finances, her role as a mother and stepmother. Their apartment reflected the strain. Claire kept the place tidy, but her art supplies had been pushed into a corner. Her creative outlets were disappearing under the weight of daily survival. Their daughter, Claire's little girl, was young, still in elementary school. On the night of January 20th, she was staying with her grandmother, just a short distance away. That night, they were throwing a party. Cain was in his mid-40s. Milestone birthdays can do strange things to people. They make us reflect on where we've been, where we're going, what we've accomplished. For Cain, this birthday seemed to carry extra weight. Friends said he wanted something memorable. He wanted his birthday to matter. According to multiple witnesses, Cain had expressed a specific desire to Claire in the weeks leading up to the party. He wanted a threesome. He framed it as a birthday gift, something special, something he'd been thinking about. Claire reportedly struggled with the request. She didn't outright refuse, but she didn't agree either. Friends said she felt cornered, unsure how to navigate the situation without causing a fight. That tension was simmering beneath the surface when the party began. The gathering started small. A handful of friends, some drinks, music playing in the background. People described the mood as relaxed. Claire seemed happy, social, moving around the apartment, making sure everyone had what they needed. At some point early in the evening, Cain opened the gun safe in the bedroom. The apartment was loaded with weapons. He and Claire owned 2 handguns, a .40 caliber and a 9mm, plus other long guns stored in and around the safe. Several guests saw Cain take the guns out and show them around. Both he and Claire handled the firearms. This detail would become crucial later, when investigators tried to make sense of the gunshot residue found on Cain's hands. As the night wore on, guests began to leave. By the early hours of the morning, only one person remained, a woman who didn't know Cain and Claire well. She was friendly with some of the other guests and had stayed to keep the party going a little longer. What happened next would become the most disputed part of the entire case. According to this final guest, Claire approached her quietly sometime after 2 in the morning. She asked if the woman would be interested in staying longer. The guest said she understood immediately what Claire was implying. She politely declined. A few minutes later, Cain joined the conversation. The guest said he was more direct. He told her it was his birthday. He told her it would mean a lot to him. She declined again. Claire, according to the witness, accepted the refusal with grace. She thanked the woman for coming and walked her toward the door. But Cain, the witness said, seemed irritated. She recalled him saying something along the lines of, "This isn't really about her. It's my birthday." The woman left. She walked down the hallway to another apartment where a neighbor was still awake. They sat together, listening to music, chatting about the night. Less than an hour later, she would be among those calling for help. At approximately 3:25 a.m., neighbors in the apartment building started hearing things. Multiple people reported the same sequence of sounds. Someone yelling, "No, no, no," a man shouting, "Get back here," sounds of a scuffle, and then a loud bang. Some neighbors thought it was just a late-night argument. They went back to sleep. But one neighbor would later testify that the high-pitched voice yelling after the gunshot sounded like it could have been Cain, not Claire. This observation would become a critical point of debate. If the screaming continued after the gunshot, then Claire was already gone. The voice had to belong to Cain. Minutes after the gunshot, around 3:25 a.m., Cain ran to the building manager's office, screaming that his wife had shot herself. The building manager and others immediately called 911. Police were dispatched. Snow was beginning to fall outside. When officers arrived at the apartment, they found Cain with Claire on the bedroom floor. There was blood on his clothes, on his hands, on the carpet. A .40 caliber handgun was lying on the floor just outside the gun safe. But there was a problem. The bullet that killed Claire came from a 9mm. And that gun was inside the closed safe. Claire was pronounced dead at 3:28 a.m. Officers immediately detained Cain. He was highly emotional, erratic, difficult to calm down. They needed to secure the scene. They needed to figure out what had happened. Inside the bedroom, investigators found signs of a struggle. A picture frame was broken. A fan had been knocked over. A laundry basket was tipped on its side. These details stood out because, according to everyone who knew Claire, she kept the apartment meticulously organized. The disorder suggested something violent had occurred. Near Claire's head, investigators found a 9mm shell casing. According to trial testimony, the medical examiner would later determine that a single bullet had entered behind her right ear, traveling through her brain. Forensic experts testified that the wound lacked soot or stippling. Physical evidence that would indicate a close-contact shot. Self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head are almost always contact wounds. The gun is pressed directly against the skin. According to the prosecution's case, Claire's wound didn't match that pattern. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're still following along, type "I'm still here" so we can see who's staying until the end. Toxicology results showed Claire's blood alcohol content at 0.294. More than 3 times the legal limit for driving. She was extremely intoxicated. Cain's blood alcohol level was also elevated, though not as high as Claire's. Gunshot residue tests came back with another troubling finding. According to trial testimony, Cain's hands tested positive for residue. Claire's hands tested negative. For investigators, the physical evidence was starting to tell a story. The gun found inside the safe. The wound location. The lack of residue on Claire's hands. The broken items in the room. The neighbors who heard a woman screaming, "No, no, no." They believed Cain had killed his wife. Detectives interviewed Cain twice. The first interview took place shortly after Claire's death. Cain told them there had been no argument that night. He said he and Claire had gone to bed peacefully after the party. He claimed he was in another part of the apartment when he heard a loud pop. He ran to the bedroom and found Claire on the floor. He insisted she had shot herself. But when detectives asked about the party, about the final guest, about what had happened after everyone left, Cain said nothing unusual had occurred. He denied that he and Claire had invited the woman to stay. He denied any conflict. The second interview came later, after investigators had spoken with witnesses. This time, Cain changed his story. He admitted that he and Claire had approached the final guest. He acknowledged that the woman had declined their invitation. But he still maintained that Claire's death was a suicide. Detectives confronted him with the forensic evidence, the wound location, the gunshot residue, the gun found in the safe. Cain seemed genuinely shocked when they told him the bullet had entered behind Claire's right ear. He said he didn't remember moving the gun. He said he didn't remember much of anything after hearing the gunshot. His memory, he claimed, was fragmented due to how much he'd been drinking. The interviews revealed inconsistencies that investigators couldn't ignore. In his first account, Cain painted a peaceful evening with no tension, no arguments, no problems. In his second account, he admitted there had been an invitation extended to the final guest, but downplayed any negative reaction when she declined. Detectives noticed how his emotional state seemed to shift during questioning. At times he appeared devastated, sobbing uncontrollably. At other times, he seemed almost detached, as if reciting a script he'd rehearsed. They noted these observations in their reports. Claire's best friend provided investigators with a detailed history of the relationship. She described multiple occasions when Claire had expressed fear of Cain's temper. According to this friend, Claire had once called her in a panic, saying Cain had become violent during an argument. The friend claimed that Claire told her about an incident before their wedding when Cain allegedly grabbed a gun during a heated dispute. These accounts painted a picture of a woman who had been living with fear for years, trying to manage a volatile relationship while raising her daughter and maintaining her job. The final guest's testimony proved crucial. She described in detail how the evening had unfolded. She said the party had been fun at first, with everyone drinking, dancing, enjoying themselves. As people began to leave, she stayed behind because she was having a good conversation with another guest. She had no intention of staying long. But then Claire approached her with what seemed like a carefully worded invitation. The guest said Claire appeared nervous, almost apologetic. She got the sense that Claire wasn't entirely comfortable with what she was suggesting. When Cain joined the conversation, the dynamic changed. According to the witness, he was more assertive, more direct. He made it clear that this was something he wanted, something he'd been hoping for. The guest said she felt uncomfortable with the pressure. She declined politely, making it clear she wasn't interested. Claire seemed to accept this immediately, even appearing somewhat relieved. But Cain's reaction was different. The guest described him as frustrated, disappointed. She remembered his comment about the night being for him, not for Claire. That comment stuck with her. It suggested an entitlement, an expectation that his desires should be prioritized. After declining the invitation, the guest left the apartment and went to visit another friend who lived in the same building. They sat together, talking quietly so as not to disturb other residents. The guest estimated they were there for about 30 to 40 minutes before Cain came running through the building in a panic, saying Claire had shot herself. His sudden appearance startled everyone. He was panicked, incoherent, barely able to get the words out. People immediately called 911. The 911 call itself provides a glimpse into those chaotic moments. Callers can be heard on the recording explaining to the dispatcher that a man just came saying his wife shot herself. In the background, Cain's voice is audible, frantic, pleading. When police arrived on scene, they immediately took control of the situation. They separated Cain from Claire's body and began securing the apartment. The first officers on scene noted the visible signs of struggle in the bedroom, the broken picture frame, the overturned fan, the disturbed laundry basket. They photographed everything before touching anything. They documented the position of Claire's body, the location of the .40 caliber handgun on the floor outside the safe, the 9mm inside the safe, and the blood patterns on the carpet and walls. Paramedics confirmed what everyone already suspected: Claire was dead. There was no saving her. The medical response team pronounced her dead at 3:28 a.m. The cause of death was obvious: a gunshot wound to the head. What wasn't obvious was who had pulled the trigger. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone you care about. Understanding these cases can help us recognize warning signs and stay informed about the realities of domestic violence. The gun safe presented perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence. Investigators found the 9mm handgun, the murder weapon, inside the closed safe, with the .40 caliber lying on the floor just outside. The safe also contained other weapons. Crime scene technicians carefully documented the safe's condition and the position of all the firearms. This was a critical finding. If Claire had shot herself, someone had to have put the gun back inside the safe afterward. Someone else had to have been involved in what happened after the shooting. According to trial testimony, the medical examiner's report provided additional evidence that contradicted suicide. The bullet entered behind Claire's right ear at a slightly downward angle. The trajectory suggested the shot came from someone standing or kneeling beside her, not from Claire holding the gun herself. Forensic experts testified that the absence of soot and stippling meant the gun had been fired from at least several inches away, unusual for a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Most people who shoot themselves press the gun directly against their head. The contact leaves distinctive marks. According to the prosecution's case, Claire's wound had none of these marks. Forensic pathologists who reviewed the case noted another detail during trial. Claire's hands showed no defensive wounds, no signs that she tried to grab the gun or fight off an attacker. But there was a mark on her palm that some experts interpreted as possibly being from gripping a gun. This ambiguous finding would later be cited by the defense and the appeals court as evidence of reasonable doubt. The prosecution argued the mark could have come from anything: a fall, contact with objects in the room during a struggle, or post-mortem handling of her body. The gunshot residue findings were damning for Cain. When someone fires a gun, microscopic particles of gunpowder, primer, and metal are expelled from the weapon. These particles land on the shooter's hands, face, and clothing. Testing revealed the presence of these particles on Cain's hands. Claire's hands, however, tested negative. The defense would later argue that Cain could have gotten residue on his hands by handling the guns earlier in the evening during the party, or by touching Claire's body and the gun after the shooting. Forensic experts testified that while transfer is possible, the pattern and concentration of residue on Cain's hands were more consistent with firing a weapon than with secondary transfer. Blood spatter analysis added another layer to the investigation. The blood patterns in the bedroom told a story of violence. High-velocity spatter on the walls indicated the explosive nature of the gunshot. Cast-off patterns suggested movement after the initial impact. The location and distribution of blood helped investigators reconstruct the likely positions of both Cain and Claire at the moment of the shooting. The analysis suggested Claire had been near the bed, possibly trying to move away from someone, when she was shot. As investigators dug deeper into Cain and Claire's relationship, a clearer picture emerged. Bank records showed financial stress. Claire's income was the sole source of money coming into the household. Credit card statements revealed mounting debt. Friends confirmed that Claire had expressed anxiety about their financial situation multiple times in the months before her death. Cain's employment history became relevant to the investigation. He had worked steadily in construction for years, but had lost his job several months before the shooting. Friends and family members gave different accounts of why he lost that job. Some said the company downsized. Others suggested there had been conflicts with management. Regardless of the reason, the job loss had created significant strain in the household. Cain had struggled to find new employment. The longer he remained unemployed, the more tension built between him and Claire. The prosecution built their case around the theory that Cain had killed Claire in a moment of rage following the rejection of his birthday request. They argued that the alcohol consumption, the sexual rejection, and the underlying relationship tensions had created a perfect storm. When the final guest declined to participate in the threesome Cain had been fantasizing about, his frustration boiled over. After the guest left, an argument erupted between Cain and Claire. The argument escalated into violence. In a moment of fury, Cain grabbed the 9mm, shot Claire, and then put the gun back in the safe before calling for help. The prosecution presented this timeline to the jury with supporting evidence at every step. The neighbors heard the argument, Claire saying no, Cain telling her to get back. The broken items in the room documented the physical struggle. The gunshot wound indicated murder, not suicide. The gun found inside the safe proved someone had handled it after the shooting. The gunshot residue on Cain's hands confirmed he'd fired the gun. And his changing stories to police suggested consciousness of guilt. The defense team faced a difficult challenge. The physical evidence was overwhelming. They needed to create reasonable doubt without directly contradicting the forensics. Their strategy focused on three main arguments. First, they emphasized the extreme intoxication of both Cain and Claire. With blood alcohol levels that high, they argued, anything could have happened. Memory becomes unreliable. Motor control deteriorates. Judgment disappears. They suggested that if Cain had fired the gun, he might not remember doing so. He might have been so drunk that he genuinely believed Claire had shot herself. Second, the defense attacked the reliability of witness testimony. They pointed out inconsistencies in what neighbors reported hearing. Some said they heard a woman scream after the gunshot. Others said they heard nothing. The defense argued that in the confusion of the moment, with people waking from sleep to unexpected sounds, witness accounts couldn't be trusted. They suggested the possibility that the screaming neighbors heard could have been from an earlier argument unrelated to the shooting, or from Cain's panic after discovering Claire's body. Third, and most controversially, the defense suggested Claire might have been suicidal. They presented no concrete evidence of this, no suicide note, no history of mental health treatment, no prior attempts. Instead, they pointed to Claire's high blood alcohol level and argued that someone that intoxicated might act impulsively. They suggested the mark on Claire's palm could indicate she had gripped the gun. They noted that depression often goes undiagnosed, that Claire could have been silently struggling without anyone knowing. This argument angered Claire's family and friends, who vehemently rejected any suggestion that Claire would have taken her own life and left her young daughter without a mother. The trial lasted 5 days. The courtroom was packed every day with Claire's family, friends, and community members who wanted to see justice served. Cain's family also attended, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, maintaining his innocence. The divide between the two families was palpable. Emotions ran high throughout the proceedings. Several times, the judge had to call for order when witnesses broke down crying on the stand or when family members reacted audibly to testimony. The prosecution called Claire's best friend to the stand first. She testified about the alleged pattern of abuse, the gun incident before the wedding, the phone calls where Claire expressed fear. She described Claire as a devoted mother who would never abandon her daughter. She painted a picture of a woman trapped in a dangerous relationship, trying to hold everything together while living in constant anxiety. The defense cross-examined her aggressively, pointing out that she had no first-hand knowledge of the gun incident. She only knew what Claire had told her. They suggested she might be misremembering or exaggerating details because of her grief. Neighbors who heard the argument testified about the sequence of sounds. Each one described the same pattern: yelling, scuffling, gunshot. But they differed on details. One neighbor said the woman's voice sounded terrified. Another said the yelling sounded like a typical argument. The neighbor who thought the post-gunshot screaming sounded male provided testimony that particularly interested the prosecution. If Cain was the one screaming after the shot, it meant Claire was already dead or dying. It meant he knew what had happened. It undermined his claim that he'd been in another room and simply heard a pop. Forensic experts spent hours on the stand explaining the technical aspects of the evidence. The gunshot residue specialist walked the jury through how particles are deposited, how they transfer, and why the pattern on Cain's hands indicated he'd fired a weapon rather than just touched one. The medical examiner explained wound dynamics, showing diagrams of typical self-inflicted gunshots versus homicidal gunshots. She pointed out that in her 15 years of experience, she'd never seen a self-inflicted gunshot wound behind the ear with no contact marks. The blood spatter analyst used photographs and drawings to demonstrate how Claire's position and the shooter's position could be determined from the blood patterns in the room. The detective who conducted Cain's interviews testified about the inconsistencies in his statements. He played portions of the recorded interviews for the jury, allowing them to hear Cain's voice, his tone, his changing narrative. The detective pointed out specific contradictions. First denying the invitation happened, then admitting it. First claiming he was in another room, then seeming uncertain about where he'd been. First saying he didn't touch the gun, then acknowledging he might have. The detective testified that in his experience, innocent people might forget details due to trauma, but they don't typically change their entire story after being confronted with witness statements. The defense called their own experts to counter the prosecution's forensic testimony. Their gunshot residue expert testified that transfer was more common than the prosecution suggested. He said Cain handling the guns earlier in the evening could easily explain the residue on his hands. Their pathologist reviewed the medical examiner's findings and suggested the wound could be consistent with self-infliction if Claire had held the gun at an unusual angle. Their psychologist testified about the effects of extreme alcohol intoxication on memory and behavior, explaining how someone with Cain's blood alcohol level might experience blackouts or confabulation, filling in memory gaps with false information that feels real. Closing arguments gave both sides the chance to tie their cases together. The prosecutor walked the jury through the evidence methodically. She displayed photographs of the crime scene, pointing out each detail that contradicted suicide. She argued that when you looked at everything together, only one conclusion made sense: Cain Wilkins had murdered his wife. Then came the statement that would later overturn the conviction. The prosecutor, in her closing remarks, told the jury, hold him accountable for what he did, for the orphan he made their child. The defense objected immediately. The judge overruled the objection. But those words, the orphan he made, would echo through the case for years to come. The appeals court would later determine that this emotional appeal crossed a line, unfairly prejudicing the jury by invoking the image of Claire's orphaned daughter. The defense attorney's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. He acknowledged that the case was tragic, that Claire's death was devastating. But he reminded the jury that their job wasn't to decide if something bad had happened. Everyone agreed something terrible had occurred. Their job was to determine if the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Cain intentionally killed Claire. He walked through the evidence again, pointing out every uncertainty, every alternative explanation, every gap in the prosecution's timeline. He argued that the high level of intoxication made everything uncertain. He suggested that Claire could have shot herself and that Cain, in his drunken panic, could have put the gun in the safe without remembering doing so. He urged the jury to consider whether they could send a man to prison for decades based on a case with so many questions. The jury deliberated for a while. Claire's family waited anxiously, praying for justice. Cain's family held out hope for acquittal. When the jury finally announced they'd reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly. Everyone wanted to hear the outcome. The foreman stood and read the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing came several weeks later. Colorado law allowed for a sentence of 16 to 48 years for second-degree murder. The judge considered the circumstances of the case, the violence involved, the loss of life. He sentenced Cain to 48 years, the maximum allowed. In his sentencing remarks, the judge noted the tragedy of the case, the loss felt by Claire's daughter, and the severity of taking another person's life. Cain was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. For Claire's family, it felt like closure. Justice had been served. But the story didn't end there. Cain's attorneys immediately filed an appeal. They raised multiple issues, but the one that gained traction was the prosecutor's closing statement about making Claire's daughter an orphan. The Colorado Court of Appeals reviewed the case carefully. They acknowledged that the evidence against Cain was strong. But they also recognized that the prosecutor's statement could have improperly influenced the jury. Appeals courts have strict rules about emotional appeals. Prosecutors can present facts and argue their case forcefully, but they can't try to manipulate jurors' emotions through references to victims' families, especially children. In their written opinion, the appeals court addressed the improper statement as the primary basis for overturning the conviction. They concluded that the prosecutor's words crossed a legal line, creating prejudice that could have affected the jury's verdict. They emphasized that their job wasn't to retry the case or determine guilt or innocence. Their job was to ensure Cain had received a fair trial. They concluded that the prosecutor's improper statement meant that Cain hadn't received the fair trial he was entitled to under law. They overturned the conviction and ordered a new trial. In September 2022, for years after his conviction, Cain Wilkins walked out of prison a free man. The decision devastated Claire's family. Her mother gave emotional interviews to local media, expressing outrage at the appeals court's decision. She said her daughter would never get real justice. She said the system had failed Claire, failed her granddaughter, failed everyone who loved Claire. She couldn't understand how a jury's guilty verdict, supported by so much evidence, could be thrown out because of one sentence. She felt like they were being forced to relive the trauma all over again, to go through another trial, to hear all the painful details again. Claire's friends organized rallies and vigils. They wore purple, Claire's favorite color, and carried signs demanding justice. They started a social media campaign sharing Claire's story, trying to keep public attention on the case. They wanted to ensure that prosecutors would pursue a retrial aggressively. They feared that with time, witnesses' memories would fade, evidence might be lost or mishandled, and the case might fall apart completely. Their worst nightmare was that Cain might never face accountability for Claire's death. Domestic violence advocacy groups rallied around the case. They pointed out that Claire's story was all too common, a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, killed by someone she loved, and then having the justice system fail to hold her killer accountable. Statistics show that the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims is when they try to leave or when they refuse their abuser's demands. Claire's refusal to participate in Cain's birthday fantasy fit this pattern. These groups used Claire's case to highlight the need for better domestic violence protections, better training for law enforcement, and stronger prosecution of domestic homicides. For Claire's family, this felt like a slap in the face. Claire couldn't rebuild her life. She couldn't see her daughter grow up. She was gone forever, while Cain got a second chance. The case remains in legal limbo. Prosecutors have indicated they intend to retry Cain, but no trial date has been set. Legal experts speculate about the challenges of a retrial. Witnesses' memories have faded. Some witnesses have moved away. The emotional impact of testifying once was traumatic for many people, asking them to do it again will be difficult. The defense will undoubtedly be careful about any statements that could be seen as prejudicial, learning from what happened in the first trial. The case raises profound questions about the criminal justice system. How much weight should appellate courts give to improper statements by prosecutors? Was the statement about Claire's orphan daughter really prejudicial enough to overturn a conviction based on substantial evidence? Should appeals courts second-guess jury verdicts, or should they defer to jurors who heard all the evidence and saw witnesses testify in person? Different legal scholars have different views on these questions. There are also questions about forensic evidence and reasonable doubt. The defense successfully created doubt about seemingly solid evidence, suggesting the gunshot residue could have transferred, proposing that Claire might have gripped the gun despite testing negative for residue, arguing that extreme intoxication explained away inconsistencies in Cain's statements. This raises the question of what standard of proof really means. If forensic evidence can always be explained away with alternative theories, how does any case ever meet the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt? The mark on Claire's hand became a focal point in discussions about the case. Defense experts suggested this mark could have been from gripping the gun. Prosecution experts countered that the mark was inconsistent with gun grip patterns and could have come from the struggle or from falling. But Claire's family and supporters argue that one ambiguous mark shouldn't outweigh all the other evidence: the gun found in the safe, the wound location, the lack of residue on Claire's hands, the neighbors who heard her screaming no. The neighbor who reported hearing a high-pitched male voice after the gunshot provided testimony that seemed to support the prosecution's case. If someone was screaming after Claire was shot, it had to be Cain, because Claire was dead or dying. But the defense argued this witness could have been mistaken about the timing, that the screaming could have come before the shot, or that the witness was confused in the chaos of being awakened by loud noises. Claire's blood alcohol level became both a prosecution and defense talking point. The prosecution used it to show that Claire was severely impaired, making her an easy target for Cain's violence. She wouldn't have been able to fight back effectively. She might not have been able to escape when the argument turned physical. The defense used the same evidence to suggest Claire might have been unstable, possibly suicidal, certainly impaired enough that her actions were unpredictable. They asked the jury to consider whether someone with a blood alcohol level of 0.294 could be capable of anything, including self-harm. But Claire's friends rejected this narrative completely. They testified that Claire loved her daughter fiercely. She talked constantly about wanting to see her daughter grow up, graduate from school, get married. She made plans for the future. She talked about goals she wanted to achieve. These aren't the words and actions of someone contemplating suicide. Claire's friends believed the defense was trying to smear her memory, to paint her as unstable or depressed when she was actually a woman fighting to survive in a difficult situation. The financial stress in the household provided context for the relationship dynamics. Claire carried the entire financial burden after Cain lost his job. She worked long hours at the store, dealing with customers, managing inventory, handling personnel issues. Then she came home to a husband who was unemployed and frustrated. Friends said Claire rarely complained, but they could see the exhaustion in her face. They could hear it in her voice when she talked about her day. The pressure of being the sole provider while also managing her role as a mother and stepmother was crushing her. Cain's unemployment added another layer of tension. Friends of the couple noted that Cain seemed increasingly frustrated as the months went by without finding new work. He'd built his identity around being a construction worker, around doing physical labor, around providing for his family. Losing that identity was difficult. Some people who knew him said he became more withdrawn, more irritable. Others said he seemed the same as always. These conflicting accounts made it difficult to establish a clear picture of Cain's mental state in the months leading up to Claire's death. The request for a threesome as a birthday gift shocked many people who heard about it during the trial. The fact that Cain allegedly framed this request as a birthday gift added another dimension to the story. It suggested an expectation that Claire should give him what he wanted because it was his special day. It implied that his desires should take priority over her comfort or consent. The final party guest's testimony about Cain saying, "It's not really about her. It's my birthday," reinforced this interpretation. In that moment, when the guest declined and Cain responded with frustration, it revealed something about how he viewed the situation. He saw his birthday as justification for getting what he wanted, regardless of how others felt about it. After the guest left and went to another area of the building, she spent time with other residents for roughly 30 to 40 minutes before Cain came running through in a panic. That timeline matters because it meant Cain and Claire were alone together for that entire period. Whatever happened between them, whatever argument erupted, whatever violence occurred, it happened during those 30 to 40 minutes. The neighbors heard the sounds of that confrontation, the yelling, the struggle, the gunshot. But the specific details of what was said, what sparked the final confrontation, what exactly transpired in those moments before Claire died, those details died with her. The 911 call recording became one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. Listening to it, you can hear the genuine panic in everyone's voices. People trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher. The dispatcher asking questions, trying to get critical information. Cain in the background, his voice breaking, repeating that Claire shot herself. The entire exchange lasted several minutes, but it felt much longer. Every second mattered. Every instruction from the dispatcher could have made a difference, though ultimately Claire was beyond saving by the time the call came in. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives arrived and began walking through the apartment, noting the condition of each room. The bedroom where Claire died showed clear signs of disturbance. The broken picture frame, the overturned fan, the disturbed laundry basket, these weren't normal conditions for a room. Something violent had occurred. But other rooms in the apartment were neat, undisturbed. Whatever happened had been confined to the bedroom, suggesting the confrontation began and ended there. Processing the gun safe took time. Investigators photographed it from every angle. They documented its condition and the firearms inside and around it. They carefully documented the scene. The 9mm handgun was removed, documented, and sent for forensic analysis. The fact that the murder weapon was found inside the safe while the .40 caliber was on the floor outside became significant evidence. Someone had to have handled the guns after the shooting. The shell casing found near Claire's head underwent ballistics analysis. Experts confirmed it came from the 9mm found in the safe. They matched the firing pin markings, the ejector markings, all the microscopic details that make each gun's signature unique. There was no question that the gun found in the safe was the weapon that killed Claire. The only question was who pulled the trigger. Blood spatter analysis revealed additional details about the shooting. The pattern of blood on the walls suggested Claire had been in a relatively upright position when shot, either standing or sitting. The direction of the spatter indicated the shooter had been to her right side, slightly behind her. The cast-off pattern suggested movement after the initial impact, consistent with Claire falling to the floor. All of this evidence helped investigators understand the physical dynamics of the shooting, even without witnesses to describe what actually happened. The psychological aspects of the case fascinated true crime observers. What drives someone to kill their spouse? Was this a crime of passion, a moment of rage that spiraled out of control? Or was there premeditation, planning, intent to kill? The second-degree murder charge suggested the jury believed Cain acted intentionally but without premeditation. He didn't plan to kill Claire that night, but when his anger exploded, he made a conscious decision to grab the gun and shoot her. This interpretation fit with the prosecution's theory: rejection, argument, escalation, violence, death. But the defense painted a different psychological picture. They described a man so intoxicated he barely knew what was happening. They suggested his memory gaps were genuine, that he truly didn't remember the critical moments. They proposed that if he did shoot Claire, it could have been accidental, a drunken mishandling of a firearm during an argument. They wanted the jury to see Cain as someone who made terrible mistakes while intoxicated, not as a cold-blooded killer. The jury's decision to convict on second-degree murder rather than first-degree suggested they found middle ground. They believed Cain killed Claire intentionally, but they didn't believe he'd planned it in advance. The distinction matters significantly in terms of sentencing. First-degree murder in Colorado can carry life without parole. Second-degree murder carries a maximum of 48 years, which is exactly what Cain received. The jury's verdict reflected their interpretation of the evidence, a spontaneous act of violence, not a premeditated murder. Claire's daughter, now growing up without her mother, represents the most tragic aspect of this entire case. She lost her mother at a young age. She'll grow up with questions about what happened, why it happened, whether it could have been prevented. She'll hear people debate whether her stepfather murdered her mother or whether it was a tragic accident. She'll live with the uncertainty, the trauma, the loss. Claire's family has worked hard to protect the girl's privacy, to give her as normal a childhood as possible under devastating circumstances. But there's no escaping the reality that this little girl is growing up motherless because of what happened that January night. The retrial, whenever it happens, will face significant challenges. Witness memories have faded after more than 6 years. Some witnesses may be unwilling to testify again after the trauma of the first trial. Physical evidence has been in storage, potentially degrading. The defense will likely reference concerns that were raised, using those points to argue for acquittal. Prosecutors will need to overcome the psychological impact of having won once and then having that victory overturned. Jurors in the retrial will know about the first trial's outcome, potentially influencing their thinking. There's also the question of whether prosecutors can avoid the mistakes that led to the overturned conviction. They'll need to present their case passionately but within the bounds of proper advocacy. They can't mention Claire's daughter as an orphan. They'll need to be careful about emotional appeals generally. Defense attorneys will be watching closely for any misstep, ready to object and create grounds for another appeal if Cain is convicted again. The case also highlights the challenges of prosecuting domestic violence homicides. Often these cases lack eyewitnesses. They rely heavily on forensic evidence, which can be subject to conflicting interpretations. They require prosecutors to tell a story that makes sense of the physical evidence, the relationship history, and the circumstances surrounding the death. Defense attorneys work to create doubt about each element of that story. Juries must decide which narrative they believe, often without definitive proof either way. Domestic violence advocates emphasize that Claire's case follows a common pattern. Abuse often escalates when victims assert boundaries or try to leave. Claire's refusal to participate in Cain's birthday fantasy could have been the boundary assertion that triggered fatal violence. The fact that she died just hours after refusing him fits this pattern. Advocates use cases like Claire's to educate people about warning signs, controlling behavior, escalating demands, responses to rejection that seem disproportionate. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with Claire's story. Drop a comment, tell us what you think about this case. Should the conviction have been overturned? Do you think Cain will be convicted at retrial? What would you do if you were on that jury? Looking ahead, Claire's family waits for news about the retrial. Every delay feels like another injustice. Time passes, and Cain remains free while Claire remains dead. They want closure. They want to know that Claire's life mattered, that her death will be answered with accountability. They want her daughter to grow up knowing that the justice system fought for her mother, that people cared enough to pursue truth no matter how long it took. The truth about what happened in that bedroom on January 21, 2018, is known to only one living person. Cain is the only one who can say with certainty what occurred. His version has changed, shifted, evolved as he's been confronted with evidence. His current story is that he doesn't remember clearly because of his intoxication. But the physical evidence tells its own story. The gun found in the safe. The wound behind Claire's ear. The gunshot residue on his hands. The sounds neighbors heard. The broken items in the room. All of these facts create a picture of what happened, even without Cain's admission. This case reminds us how precious life is, how quickly things can change, how violence can erupt in spaces we think are safe. Claire went to bed the night before not knowing it would be her last night alive. She celebrated her husband's birthday, hosted friends, tried to navigate a difficult request, and ended up dead on her bedroom floor. The suddenness of it, the transformation from life to death, the permanence of what happened, all of it underscores how fragile existence can be. For anyone in a relationship marked by control, anger, or fear, Claire's story serves as a warning. Pay attention to the red flags. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Reach out for help before it's too late. Tell friends what's happening. Make a safety plan. Know that you deserve to be in a relationship free from fear and violence. Claire's death wasn't inevitable. With different choices, different circumstances, different interventions, she might still be alive. But she's not, and we can't change that. What we can do is learn from her story, recognize similar patterns in our own lives or the lives of people we care about, and act before tragedy strikes. Whatever happens at retrial, Claire's story won't end. She'll be remembered by everyone who loved her. Her daughter will carry her mother's memory forward. Her friends will continue sharing stories about her. True crime audiences will continue discussing her case, debating the evidence, and considering what justice means. Claire's life mattered. Her death matters. And the pursuit of truth and accountability in her case matters, not just for her family but for everyone who believes that violence should have consequences. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to hear Claire's story. Thank you for staying until the end and for engaging with the difficult questions this case raises. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update on this case or other true crime stories we cover.